me? Can you hear me? Good, 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 good. I'm also very glad that it's a 3-book deal. Anyway. Right, well, I've got my timer. Here we are. This is my cover. As Rosie said, I was previously a non-fiction writer. I turned around a few years ago, having taken 15 years to write 2 books, and thought, I can't do this again. I've had enough. It takes me 3 years to check a sentence, and I think I'm going to die if I have to go into the corridor of another non-fiction book. So I decided I wanted to write some fiction, but history is still my thing. And so I had been thinking for a long time about an idea. It had been sloshing around for a few years. I decided I wanted to write a book about the thugs of India, and about the man who crushed them, a man called William Sleeman. Well, who are these people? The thugs were Indian roadside bandits who, at the beginning of the 19th century, would befriend and then strangle unwary travellers on the roads of India, and then steal their stuff and go on to the next. And Sleeman was a sort of forgotten Englishman. He was a colonial hero, a sort of type that we've really forgotten about. But he was also a rather interesting Renaissance man. He was the first person to identify fossils in India, the first person to collect stories about wolf children, the stories that later inspired Kipling to write The Jungle Book. He was a brilliant linguist and spoke sort of hundreds of different dialects, and he was very interested in agriculture and trying to improve the crops of peasant Indians. But the thing he's mainly famous for is, and here's a picture of him, here we are, this is Sleeman, was as the nemesis and chronicler of the thugs. He is the reason that the word thug has entered the English language. So the story of the thugs, I suppose, begins, for us anyway, in 1830, when in the Calcutta Gazette, which was the journal of record for the Englishmen who ruled India at that time, from Calcutta, which is the capital of India, there was an article published anonymously which described the thugs, really for the first time. They were described as these gangs of bandits, or dacoits as they were known. They were sort of hereditary criminals, a sort of nationwide guild of murderers who claimed to be devoted to the goddess Kali, the goddess of destruction. There she is with her necklace of heads, and usually she's shown with a skirt of arms, severed arms, lovely, standing on the demon who she killed to save mankind. I can't remember his name, I'm afraid. And what happened was they would travel in groups of 15 to 100 through the dry season on the roads of India, mainly in central India, between Calcutta and Bombay. And they would approach unwary groups of travellers who, the roads, of course, were very, very long. This is pre-railway. And they would disguise themselves in order to kind of fit with what they thought would ingratiate themselves with the travellers. So they might disguise themselves as pilgrims, they might disguise themselves as musicians, a group of musicians, or even policemen. And there would be a chief inveigler, a deceiver, and his job was to be the charmer. He would persuade the victims to travel with them. He would say, it's very dangerous on the roads. What we should do is we should all travel together to keep ourselves safe. What a brilliant idea. They're all wandering along. They might travel together for a day, for a week, and each night they'd gather around the campfire, and the thugs would sing songs and tell stories, and everybody got very cozy. And then one night, the inveigler makes a sign. It might be, please somebody fill my pipe of tobacco, or it might be, ha-ha, look, a bird. That's very good because everybody, all the victims, look up. And then at that moment, the strangler who's standing behind each victim takes his scarf, a rumal, an orange scarf in which a knot is tied, and he slips it over the neck of the victim, and he pulls it tight. And at each side of the victim, there is a hand holder, and his job is to hold onto the hands of the victim. So when he tries to go, he can't. He's stuck, and he's pushed onto the ground. Very quick, very neat. He's dead. And in a few minutes, everybody is killed. And they have a grave, a circular grave that they have dug earlier. They have special grave diggers, and these bodies are stripped of all identification, tipped into the grave. They're Stomachs are slit so that when they decompose, no horrible gases cause the grave to be discovered. They smooth it all over. They walk off. Nobody's the wiser. How horrible is that? The article talks about this, and it talks about all the rituals that this caste have developed. They say that they, for example, eat a special kind of sugarcane called gur, which they say incites bloodlust, and it's part of their initiation. And once they have tasted it, they can never go back. They are murderers for Kali forever. Well, this story was almost certainly written by William Sleeman, who about 2 years earlier had been instructed to go after the thugs. He was a small-time administrator at that time in a very anarchic part of India, Saugor and Nabuda territory, which is between, as I say, Calcutta and Bombay. And it was an area that had only recently been taken over by the East India Company, and before that had been racked by civil war, anarchy for about 40 years. So it was a very unsettled place, a place full of bandits, of course. And it turns out that he's absolutely brilliant at it. He has very few resources, but in a very short time, he's captured groups of thugs, he's extracted confessions, he's exhuming bodies. He starts building up an extraordinary system that predates, it's ahead of all contemporary policing at the time. There are lists of thugs. Each thug has a number, aliases, distinguishing marks. Nobody came up with the idea of sort of distinguishing marks for another 50 years, basically. There are maps of where their burial mounds are. There are maps of their routes, where they live. All this is initially built up through extracting confessions. And what he does is he goes to key members of the thug groups and he says, if you tell me everything, you won't be hanged, you'll be able to live with your families. But if you tell me one thing that isn't true, that's it, you will be hung. And so very quickly he builds up a sort of corpus of knowledge. Now, the official version is that Sleeman was a brilliant administrator, a brilliant executor, and he basically got rid of the thugs through genius and beautiful interrogation techniques. But of course, in the folk memory of India, it's a slightly different story. There's no doubt, it seems to me, that he used torture, there's a story about him hanging the thugs by mango trees all the way from Mirzapur to Jabalpur, that's 250 miles. And when he tried the thugs, the burdens of proof in the area of Saugor and Nabuda were much, much lower than anywhere else in India. All the trials are conducted in English, so no, they don't understand anything. All they need is two people to say they're a thug, and that's it. If you're arrested as a thug, that's it, you're going down. And in the space of about 3 or 4 years, he'd arrested thousands and thousands of men. 500, I think, were hung. 3,000 were transported to Malaya, where they were sentenced to hard labor for life. The rest got sentences of between 7 and 14 years. Have I forgotten to press any more? Oh, here they are. Oh, I forgot. Here they are, taking off the bodies. There we go, another picture. What happens next? Oh, got a bit ahead of ourselves. They are... Yes, so he transports them, and then the others get 7 to 14 years hard labor, and it's such a horrible, hard life, and the prisons are so awful that most of them die during, well before they're released. But the approvers get a special life. They get a special model prison. They're allowed to live with their families. They're allowed to earn their own living. They have to stay within the prison confines, as do their families, because Sleeman believes that they are hereditary criminals and that the children have been infected with the parents' predilections towards crime. And they are allowed to weave carpets. And in fact, in the 1880s, the existing thugs sent a lovely big carpet to Queen Victoria, and apparently she enjoyed it very, very much. And the other thing about Sleeman is that he's completely fascinated by the thugs, not just the sort of horrors of the murders, but sort of anthropologically. And he starts publishing books about the thugs, about the conversations he has with the thugs. He's transcribed them in their own dialects, translated them back into Persian and then into English. And they read extraordinarily interestingly. And, not doing too badly. These publications start to basically they sort of chime, first of all in India, and then in Britain they start to attract attention. There's a very big article about the first book he writes, Ramasayana, which is the name of the dialect. He said that the thugs spoke in the Edinburgh Review. And people become fascinated by the thugs. Firstly, I think because, of course, they're an incredibly useful sort of symbolization of the mystery and darkness and barbarity of the East. They're a fantastically convenient justification for why the British should stay in India. Look what they've done. They've managed to get rid of this centuries-old danger, this thing that stopped the roads of India from being safe when local landowners never did. And one of the things that Sleeman claimed was that local Indian landowners were actually giving protection to the thugs in return for a part of the booty. But the other thing, I think, is that the thugs also, they sort of resonate with a sort of gothic, romantic sensibility that's around at the time, if you think Bram Stoker is right coming up with Dracula at the time. And I'm just going to very briefly read you one of the transcriptions that Sleeman came up with. He quotes a thug who talks about the pleasure he takes in the hunt, in the pursuit. This thug apparently says to him, "Are you not a hunter? Do you not enjoy the thrill of stalking, pitting your cunning against that of an animal? And are you not pleased at seeing it dead at your feet? So with the thugs, who regard the stalking of men as a high form of sport. For you, Sahib, have but the instincts of the wild beast to overcome, whereas the thug has to subdue the suspicions and fears of intelligent men and women. Can you not imagine the pleasure of overcoming such protection during days of travel in their company? The joy of seeing suspicion change to friendship until that wonderful moment arrives when the rumal completes the hunt. This soft rumal, which has ended the lives of hundreds. Remorse, Sahib, never. Joy and elation, often." Whoa, baby. I mean, anyway. So the thugs enter the British consciousness, and very quickly you find strange Indian sinister groups turning up in books like The Moonstone. In Charles Dickens' Edwin Drood, it's thought that Dickens was planning to put in a sort of thug subplot, never got around it because he died in time. And then at the end, here we go. Oh, here are the reprovers in prison. I'm a bit behind myself, and there's a nice carpet they wove. And then here we are. This is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. In 1982, this is apparently a thug, circa 1982, a film that was deemed so racist that the Indian government refused to let it be shot in India. And in fact, Steven Spielberg later apologized for it. This is sort of one way in which the sort of thug myth leapt. But in fact, the other thing that happened in the intervening 170 years was really after independence, in the 50s, or in the really 60s and 70s and 80s, a generation of historians, English and British, started to reevaluate, obviously, the legacy of colonialism. One thing that happened was that they began to question the old sort of tenets of imperialist rule, and they began to question whether, in fact, the thugs had ever existed in the way that Sleeman had described them. You know, they were almost too perfect, this sort of Eastern monstrous guild of murderers. And in fact, when you looked at the evidence, you know, there are big questions. There's no doubt they weren't really. You know, the idea that Sleeman had that they were some sort of nationwide conspiracy of sort of murderers that spread right through India, it's just simply not true. I think the whole issue of Kali worship was hugely over-egged. The British were at that time really sort of turning incredibly anti-Hindu altogether. They had brought Christian missionaries over to India, and Kali sort of became this sort of monstrous manifestation, whereas, of course, in Hindi life, she was really somebody who lots of people prayed to. She is a goddess who gives sort of potency. She's a goddess of beginnings as well as endings, and so hunters would pray to her, people having babies would pray to her, businessmen starting businesses would pray to her. You know, and of course, you know, there is the whole issue of, thank you, the whole subject as the whole issue of thuggee as a very useful colonial myth of control. So what happened really in the last 30 years was, in terms of historical circles, the thugs were really regarded as a sort of colonial invention, a myth. And, you know, when you read some of the overheated stuff that was written about them, you can't help believing that's probably true. Well, this is where I came in. You know, I thought, what a great story. You know, this incredibly lurid murdering cult, this caste, this man who crushes them, but using incredibly questionable techniques, and the question of whether they actually existed at all. Well, there's one last little postscript, and I'm told I've got a minute. What's happened actually in the last 10 years is, as often happens in history, there's another revisionist flip. And a series of historians, especially anthropologists, have started to re-examine Sleeman's stuff all over again. And particularly, I've come across an anthropologist called Anastasia Pilyatski, who is a Cambridge anthropologist, and she spent several years with the Kanjars, who are a group of a caste which in India which describes itself as being a thieves' caste. And they say they pass their traditions on from father to son. She spent several years, long time studying them, came back to England, went off and read Sleeman's papers in the British Museum, British Library rather. And what struck her, two things. One was how extraordinarily similar what Sleeman had got from the thugs was, you know, the ways that they talked about their habits, you know, their habits of mind, the way they operated, the things they believed in, and her Kanjars. And also how the sorts of things he was interested in, the methods he used, really predated anthropology, which wasn't invented for another 100 years. 100 years. So we're back really, again, at the question of whether the thugs did or didn't exist. It seems unlikely they were really these murderers in the way that Sleeman thought of them. But if you go back to the original meaning of the word thug, or sag in Sanskrit, it means trickster or deceiver. And in India today, it's used for a word for a con man. So actually, it seems quite likely that these guys were a hereditary caste, probably of thieves rather than murderers, but obviously there was a bit of murdering on the side. I think the whole issue is going to be coming up, juggled around again over the next 10 years. And now I've really got to stop. Thank you very much indeed.